Welcome to Alan Skorski Reports. I'm Alan Skorski. After 2 years of the worst attack against Israel and the Jewish people, and after 2 years of the greatest moral failings of Western democracies who failed to stand with Israel against the enemies of freedom and humanity, while Israel stood alone against Iran and all their proxies, including Hamas and Hezbollah, and while Israel's hostages remained in horrific and torturous captivity, Europe called for recognition of a Palestinian state. For 2 years, while the IDF fought bravely and forcefully to destroy their enemies on the battleground, they and we, the Jewish people, were losing the war of the narrative and public relations. Under the Biden administration, Hamas terror groups masquerading as students took over college campuses, while the Biden administration looked the other way. At the Democratic Presidential Convention, President Biden said of the Hamas protesters, some of them have a point. But since January of 2025, with the Trump administration firmly in control, everything seems to have turned in Israel's favor. President Trump gave Israel the green light to destroy Hamas. Trump's envoys traveled to the Middle East to negotiate the release of the hostages. The Trump administration worked with Israel to demolish or at least decapitate Iran's nuclear capabilities. On the second anniversary of October 7th, President Trump put together a 20-point peace plan to get all the hostages released, Hamas to leave Gaza, and neighboring Arab countries to contribute in maintaining the peace and security while plans to rebuild Gaza are underway. As many suspected, it would only be a matter of time before Hamas violated the agreement, and Israel would be forced to re-engage Hamas into total submission. There is obviously too much to unpackage here, which is why I invited one of the most highly regarded and respected experts in U.S.-Israel relations and Middle East affairs, retired Israeli ambassador, and author of the Ettinger Report, Yoram Ettinger. Mr. Ambassador, it's an honor to see you again.
Well, thank you very much. It's my privilege and my pleasure.
Okay, so as I mentioned in the monologue, there's too much to unpackage. And I wanted to wait for the interview a few weeks after the peace plan started because to have you on right away and then say, what do you think will happen? Too many things. So we know now, almost a month has gone by. Hamas has violated the agreements. Donald Trump has told Israel, do what you got to do. But then again, a lot of our friends, a lot of pundits on our side were already criticizing the Trump peace plan. Because again, on paper, there's always something that we don't like. So my first question to you is this. Donald Trump did not pass down the 20 commandments. He passed down a framework of how things should go in an ideal situation, but leaving room that screw-ups and things are going to happen. So with that, what are your thoughts right now? We know that Hamas has violated the agreement. Trump has really not pushed Israel that hard. So what do you think right now is like the next step before we even go further with the rest of the plan?
Well, when one talks about the next step, the question is, what's the context of that next step? In my own humble mind, I would say that the next step must focus on the much larger context. And that larger context has to do with the Ayatollah regime. We can keep on chasing the mosquitos, so to speak, hitting Hezbollah, hitting Hamas, hitting the Houthis, but those are the mosquitoes coming out of the Ayatollah's swamp. And the way to deal with such a problem is to literally drain the swamp. Regime change. Recently, we had visits in Israel by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Vice President JD Vance. Throughout, we have visits by top military leaders from the U.S. My own hope is that when they come to Israel, they do not focus on the tumbleweeds on the road, but rather on the pending smothering sandstorm, because there's no doubt that ever since the June 13 Israeli Air Force offensive against Iran, succeeded by the U.S. offensive against Iran on June 21st, ever since then, China, North Korea, and probably Russia have been preoccupied 24/7 restoring and upgrading Iran's conventional ballistic capabilities, air defense capabilities, and nuclear capabilities. And if the US and Israel allow the so-called negotiation intermission or the negotiation phase to go on, we are going not only to play into the hands of the Ayatollah regime, we are going to provide them a golden opportunity to restore capabilities and then overwhelming not only Israel, but overwhelming every single pro-American Arab regime, all Sunni Arab regimes in the Middle East, especially the oil-producing Arab regimes, and then turned towards the so-called infidel West. There is a reason why Iran keeps on intensifying its rogue presence, rogue actions in Latin America, not only in the Persian Gulf or in the Middle East or North and East and West Africa, but in Latin America. And the reason is very simple. Their top goal has never been the Middle East. Their top goal has been what they refer to as the Great American Satan. They have a mega vision, and the mega vision or the mega goal is to establish a universal society under the rules of Shiite Islam as the only legitimate or divinely ordained legitimate religion. And in order to advance that divine or mega vision, they need to develop mega capabilities, which is the nuclear, and that requires overcoming also the mega obstacle. Israel is not the mega obstacle. NATO is not the mega obstacle. Neither are Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates. It's the US, which is the mega obstacle. And by the way, when you read the 2026 threat assessment published by the FBI, by the Homeland Security Department, by the Director of Intelligence in the US, you find out that all of them are in consensus that Iran, together with Russia and China, are expanding their network of terror sleeper cells on US soil in an attempt to weaken the US, to undermine its strategic posture, and eventually bring the US to submission. My hope that as important as is the Gaza issue, and for Israel it's very important, but much more important is the clear and present threat posed by the Ayatollah regime, a threat to the US, a threat to every single Arab ally of the US, a threat to West Europe, as well as to Israel.
So it's interesting that you make these points because North Korea doesn't surprise me. They are troublemakers, they look for attention, and they have very little global leverage. But I'm surprised that you mentioned China and Russia, and I'll tell you why. Russia right now is still bogged down with Ukraine. They're just spending so much effort there. Both China and Russia saw what the US and Israel were able to do to Iran, which in my mind would kind of make them reassess that maybe they don't want to push us too hard because they saw how both countries went in undetected and got through their defense systems. And now with Trump in China making a deal, unless I could be naive, I want to think that he's going to tell them, besides all these trade deals and tariffs we're talking about, you're not going to give Iran any more weapons. Am I naive in thinking that way?
Well, it seems to me that we have to base our assessment on the ideology of China. Same applies to the Ayatollah regime in Iran. And certainly we must not assess neither China nor the Ayatollah regime of Iran through Western lenses. The last thing that they do is conduct themselves in accordance with Western values and Western institutions. In fact, when the US conducts negotiation with Hamas, with the Houthis, with the Ayatollah regime, or with China and North Korea, the US conducts it according to more or less Webster Dictionary. Negotiation is a step towards reconciliation. But the other parties do not use Webster Dictionary.
Right.
They use rogue dictionaries. And those rogue dictionaries, as precedents instruct us, do regard negotiation as a time to lick wounds, to avoid further military defeats, restore, upgrade capabilities, and get ready for the next round against the opponent, against the enemy, in this case, against the USA. It's true that Iran was dealt very harshly, very effectively by the Israeli Air Force and then by the US Air Force. But we should go back to some precedents, among them the 1967 war. Israel obliterated completely the military infrastructure of Egypt. That was June 1967. But by December of 1967, Egypt launched the war of attrition against Israel in collaboration with the Soviet Union, causing the killing of some 300 Israelis, namely with the help of a major power. Restoration of capabilities, military capabilities of Iran is very possible, and China certainly has an interest to embarrass the US. It's true that the Israeli offensive against Iran exposed the vulnerabilities of Chinese and Russian air defenses, of Chinese and Russian and North Korean ballistic capabilities and electronics. However, they are determined to advance their goal. Unlike the West, they do not take enhanced standard of living as the major goal. At best, it's a short-term goal. In the West, the name of the game is more or less money talks. For rogue regimes, it's rogue ideology that talks transcending financial benefits. And therefore, while according to Western logic, it doesn't make sense for China or Russia to challenge Israel, to challenge the US at that point, well, Western logic is rendered completely irrelevant. And by the way, there are ample evidence to what the employment of Western perceptions or misperceptions in the conduct of US or Israeli policies in the Middle East. We know it can cause much damage. For instance, the initial stages of the Ayatollah regime. It was a US administration which dialogued with Ayatollah Khomeini when he was in exile in Paris, exiled by the Shah of Iran, who was the American policeman of the Gulf, America's top strategic asset. But Ayatollah Khomeini, being extremely smart, satanically smart, surrounded himself with Western educated young advisors, dispatching them to the American embassy in Paris, American embassy in London, American embassy in Tehran, and to Washington itself. And the US was convinced that they are dialoguing with a potential ally because they were convinced Ayatollah Khomeini was a devout Muslim, therefore anti-communist, therefore anti-Soviet, and therefore convenient for the US. Ayatollah Khomeini promised them that his interest does not extend beyond the boundaries of Iran, and his main concern, according to his advisors, was liberty for the Iranian people. And in fact, the US miscomprehension of Ayatollah Khomeini was so devastating that the US ambassador to Tehran at those days, William Sullivan, dispatched telegrams to Washington describing Ayatollah Khomeini as an Iranian edition of Gandhi. Obviously, we know that Ayatollah Khomeini was anything but Gandhi. President Carter at that time told global leaders in a special meeting in the islands of Guadeloupe 10 days before Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Tehran, which was February 1st, 1979, and meeting those global leaders, President Carter told them that according to the CIA and other intelligence agencies in the US, Ayatollah Khomeini is going to be preoccupied with tractors, not with tanks. And obviously, here in Israel, we all remember, we should remember, again, the application of Western norms to Yasser Arafat in 1993, which yielded the disastrous, suicidal Oslo Accord. And we found out very rapidly, within few days, that Arafat was not, as described by Tom Friedman, a terrorist turning pragmatist, a terrorist turning peacemaker, but he remained committed to his own ideology, which transcended any agreement with the infidel American or infidel Zionist, namely commitment to the destruction of Israel. And I would suggest that when it comes to dealing with either China or Iran or Hamas, that we should desist from resorting to Western values in dialoguing with them. Obviously, resorting to Western values make the whole world much more convenient, much less frustrating, as is the real world. But I think for the sake of our own national security, be it US or Israel, we better stick by reality than by wishful thinking or alternate reality.
Well, there is no question that Neville Chamberlain still lives. His DNA lives throughout Europe and much of the West. I tell my friends that Donald Trump, who again I think he's great on many levels, his cabinet, Marco Rubio, Hegseth, they're all great, but they're only going to be here for another few years. So China and Russia, they can afford to play us for the next years and see what happens in 20 years. So we don't know. So no, another question, because I know in another interview we spoke about you spoke about Judea and Samaria, okay, which is the proper name, not the West Bank. So Donald Trump made a few statements emphatically that he will not allow Israel to annex it. So some people again who are on my side ideologically, very angry about that statement. The way I saw it was is that he's saying, listen, I'm trying to move something right here. I'm not saying you're never going to do it, but right now, don't blow up what I'm working on. So again, I ask you, in your opinion, I don't interpret what he said as never or that he envisions Judea and Samaria as a Palestinian state. I think he's saying he was trying to show that Qatar, Saudi Arabia, for now, I'll give you some, I'll kind of hold Israel on a little bit of a leash. I'm sorry for using that term. But that he was not in any way saying this is U.S. policy forever. Do you think that that's a correct assessment, or is there something more nefarious going on behind the scenes that this is going to be new U.S. policy?
Well, there's no doubt that President Trump has been the most supportive of enhanced U.S. Israel cooperation, defense-wise and commercially. At the same time, President Trump, in my mind, is looking at the world through transactional lenses. He's a businessman, and in business, when you have disagreement with some competitor, you sit down, you identify the disagreement, you meet somewhere in the middle, or maybe 75% in your favor. You conclude an accord, you sign a piece of paper, and you shake hand, and you move on to the next transaction. It doesn't work that way in the Middle East. I don't think it works that way in most parts of the world. Namely, you mentioned the patience that Iran and China and Russia have, and they know that President Trump is going to be out of office by January 2029. The same patience applies to every single Middle East actor, and unlike Westerners, Middle East actors, and rightfully so, do preoccupy themselves with past conduct, and from then they move on to the future. They don't ignore past conduct or precedents for the sake of convenience, as Westerners usually do. When it comes to placating Saudi Arabia, there is a common misperception, which may also afflict some policymakers in the US, certainly almost all of them in West Europe. And that is the actual attitude by Arab leaders towards the concept or the idea of a Palestinian state. When you listen to Arab leaders, all of them embrace the Palestinians through a litany of statements, and all of them, most of them, repeat the notion that for the sake of future relations with Israel, Israel must concede to the Palestinians, must allow the establishment of a Palestinian state. But that's all talk. The much more important issue is the Arab walk. And when we observe the walk, not only today, but since 1948 until today, Arab leaders have never taken a tangible walk on behalf of establishing a Palestinian state. Arab attitude towards the Palestinians has been anywhere from indifferent to very negative. And there is a reason for that, because the Arabs are very much aware of the Palestinian conduct. They don't pay any attention to Palestinian talk. For them, the walk counts much more than the talk. And when it comes to the Palestinian walk in the intra-Arab context, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia remembers very well that during the 1950s, Egypt allowed the Palestinians to terrorize Israel, but within 2 years, the Palestinian leadership started collaborating with the Muslim Brotherhood inside Egypt, terrorizing their host government, and the Palestinians had to run away from Egypt to Syria, which allowed them to terrorize Israel. But after a few years, they joined forces with the Muslim Brotherhood of Syria, terrorizing Damascus. And they had to run away to Jordan, which allowed them to terrorize Israel. But after 2 years, in 1970, they attempted to topple the Hashemite regime in Jordan, which triggered a civil war, very brutal civil war, Black September, and they had to run away to Lebanon, which they plundered for 12 years, triggering series of civil wars until they were expelled from Lebanon. And then came Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, which at that time was the #1 host of Palestinians, absorbing some 400,000 Palestinians, allowing them to rise to top administrative and business positions. But when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the Palestinians, as expected, once again stabbed their host in the back, heralding Saddam Hussein as a modern-day Salah ad-Din, the mythological Muslim military leaders. And as a result, by the way, the leader of Kuwait, upon being restored after the first Gulf War, the first thing he did was expelling almost all 400,000 Palestinians from Kuwait. The bottom line is that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, as the leaders of the UAE, as the leader of Bahrain, as the leaders of Egypt and Jordan and Morocco, they all know that a Palestinian state would add fuel, not water, to the fire in the Middle East, and therefore they limit their support to embracing talk, but they refrain from any effective walk. And therefore, any thought that the U.S. has to lean on Israel in order to soothe the Arabs and pacify the Arabs simply reflects misunderstanding of what the Middle East is all about. By the way, just like the thinking that a peace accord in the Middle East ends all wars. Let's pay attention to the fact that for the last 14 centuries, there hasn't been yet intra-Muslim or intra-Arab peaceful coexistence. From 1948 until today, there have been more than 10 million Muslims killed in intra-Muslim war. We have now war raging in Sudan with millions killed and millions becoming refugees in their own countries. But contrary to that huge figure of over 10 million from 1948 through today, there have been less than 100,000 Muslims killed in war against Israel. Less than 100,000 compared to more than 10 million. That gives you an idea about the nature of the Middle East. You don't need Israel-Hamas conflict or Israel-PLO conflict or Israel-Iran war to insert turmoil into the Middle East. You eliminate Israel from the Middle East and you still have exactly the same Middle East as we have ever had. And therefore, any call on Israel to give up the control of the mountain ridges of Judea, Samaria, which are the most critical national security component of Israel's defense, any such call must be rejected. And it reflects misreading, misunderstanding of what the Middle East is all about. Israel's national security must be ready for the worst case scenario, not for the best case scenario. And as far as the US is concerned, the idea of establishing a Palestinian state is a self-destructive idea, because a Palestinian state west of the Jordan River is going to doom the pro-American Hashemite regime east of the river, transforming Jordan into another platform of anti-American Islamic terrorism, which is not going to be limited to the boundaries of Jordan. It's going to cause ripple effects southward into the Arabian Peninsula and into Egypt, threatening the survival of every single pro-American Arab regime in the Persian Gulf, in the Arabian Peninsula, as well as in Egypt. And we are talking about a region with 48% of oil reserves. So surely the US is almost self-sufficient oil-wise, but we all know that the state of the oil in the Persian Gulf impacts the price at the pump, which is a critical element of the US economy, of every single US cycle of election. And the Middle East is also the #1 epicenter of anti-American Islamic terrorism, which is active also on US soil. And last and not least, the Arabian Peninsula, which would be threatened by a Palestinian state west of the Jordan River, also is a critical junction of sea lanes, trade sea lanes between the Far East and West Europe. To allow this critical area to fall into anti-American hands, radical hands, would compromise US economy, US national security, US homeland security. And it's not only the fate of Israel which counts here, it's the future of the US itself.
Mr. Ambassador, I'm smiling and shepping nachas because I love history, and you're giving just a great history education for all those who don't know the region as well as you do. Let me go find a little bit different area. Both Saudi Arabia and Qatar have both signed on to this agreement. Both of them have funded terrorism throughout their years. But what I've seen, and again, you'll tell me if I'm wrong, Saudi Arabia, if I recall, they've moved a little bit more where they're not promoting it as much. If I know it correctly, they've eliminated anti-Semitism from their education curriculum, and they never housed any members of Hamas, whereas Qatar continues to fund anti-Semitism, to spread it, and they did house and give comfort to Hamas. So are they on the same, do they have the same interests, or do they have very different interests, but both seek to be on the good side of Donald Trump by signing on the accord?
Well, if you observe the relations between Qatar and all other Gulf states, all other Arab Gulf states, you'll find out that Qatar was blackballed by the rest of the Arab Gulf states, and it was basically the US under Biden and now under Trump, which has eased Qatar relations with the other Arab states, not because the Arab states fail to realize what role is Qatar playing, but because the US is leaning on them. Qatar is a bosom ally of the Ayatollah regime in Iran. Qatar is the #1 financial sponsor of the Muslim Brotherhood, which has its machete, just like the Ayatollah regime, at the throat of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Jordan, and Egypt, all the way to Morocco. Qatar is a major funder of anti-American terrorist movements. Saudi Arabia used to be a major supporter of Islamic terrorism until they realized that it's going to be self-destructive at the expense of their own survival. And ever since 2002 or 2003, they have desisted from supporting Islamic terrorism. In fact, Saudi Arabia used to be the #1 financial backer of the PLO, and it's been long time since they stopped supporting the PLO. Saudi Arabia used to be the #1 financial supporter of Lebanon, but ever since Hezbollah has literally taken over Lebanon, the Saudis stopped supporting Lebanon. Saudi Arabia, especially since the rise to power of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, is very much in touch with the real Middle East. That's the reason that while they don't have peace treaty with Israel, but it was the Crown Prince MBS who played the key role behind Israel's peace treaties with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and South Sudan. I don't ignore and I don't want to underestimate the central role played by President Trump during his first administration. But without the Crown Prince, they wouldn't be the Abraham Accords. And today also, we keep hearing the Saudi foreign minister talking pretty brutally towards Israel, talking pretty embracingly towards the Palestinians. But the Crown Prince allows his foreign minister to talk, but he refrains from any walk. In fact, very soon after the eruption of the current war back in November of 2023, Saudi Arabia hosted a joint summit of the Arab League and the World Organization of Islamic Countries. Upon convening in Saudi Arabia, the Palestinians, Iran, and Algeria submitted a proposal to end right away all defense, diplomatic, military, and tourist ties with Israel. That proposal was defeated by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Egypt, Jordan, and other non-Arab Muslim countries, again, because they know that advancing the proposed Palestinian state would be at the expense of every single relatively moderate Arab leader. When it comes, by the way, you mentioned education, the United Arab Emirates has gone farther than any Arab country. They literally uprooted every element of anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli fact element in their school curriculum, and they replaced it with pro-Jewish, pro-Israeli elements. Saudi Arabia has not gone that far, but they have moderated their negative education. And by the way, there is a huge difference domestically between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. In Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince is risking his life literally every single day by defying the fundamentalist Islamic establishment, the Wahhabis, which amount to some 40% of the Saudis. They are an essential element of the ruling House of Saud. The alliance between the Wahhabis and the House of Saud has guaranteed the rule of the House of Saud. The Crown Prince is the first Saudi leader to publicly defy the Wahhabis, telling them, "You are not the sole interpreter of Islam. I have a different interpretation of Islam." And by the way, you can see that when you examine the state of Saudi women, which has been westernized dramatically under the Crown Prince. While there is no peace treaty with Israel, Saudi Arabia and Israel have forged very, very impressive network of defense, agriculture, irrigation, and high-tech cooperation. And therefore, the Saudi Crown Prince, in my mind, deserves much, much credit. And I would never lump him together with Qatar, which he detests, which he would like to receive the appropriate treatment by Washington, which means anything but affinity.
Wow. Mr. Ambassador, it's been an honor and a pleasure to have you. I know you're going to be touring in the U.S. soon, and thank you for giving us just a glimpse to what you're going to be speaking about. You've been just so helpful in clarifying so many of the issues. And again, Israel has never been more at the forefront of protecting Western civilization as it is right now. So again, I thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.